African Ascent, simply speaking, is thrilled, in fact, beyond a thrill, to celebrate the 90th birthday of one of the most important figures of the 20th century, a thinker who combined philosophical curiosity, psychological depth, and an appreciation and deep understanding of history, anthropology, sociology, you name the other fields that this young man, who died at a very young age, covered. With me, and for those of you who have seen Professor Lewis Gordon before, this is not his first appearance. In fact, African Ascent considers him to be one of its regular contributors, except that he's extraordinarily busy. And summarizing his work, what he has accomplished at such a young age itself is so daunting that I would not dare to list and summarize what he has done, what he's doing, and what he proposes to do. But I must read at least a short excerpt that I picked from my research to introduce you the kind of work that this extraordinary thinker continues to do. Lewis Gordon, born in 1962, is an American philosopher who works in the areas of Africana philosophy, philosophy of human and life sciences, phenomenology, philosophy of existence, social and political theory, post-colonial thought, theories of race and racism, philosophies of liberation, aesthetics, philosophy of education, and philosophy of religion. He has written particularly extensively on race and racism, post-colonial phenomenology, Africana and Black existentialism, which I believe he himself coined, and on the works and thought of W.E. Du Bois and, of course, Frantz Fanon, the author of these remarkable books that are staring at you. African Ascent is, simply speaking, thrilled, as I said, to participate in the celebration of Frantz Fanon's 90th birthday. Happy birthday, Frantz Fanon. Welcome to African Ascent.
Thank you, Tedros. I take it that was from the Wikipedia thing on me, huh?
Correct.
Yeah, I was born in Jamaica and I grew up in the United States. And so this is a story of, similar to this guy, a person who's born one place and lives across the globe.
So what I thought we should do is to give you the forum, or for you to give yourself the forum to introduce us to Frantz Fanon. Who is he? What did he do? Why did you pick him? Why do you continue writing on him? So far, I think 3 books, and discounting numerous articles that you've written on him. And he himself, of course, is the author of these remarkable books that are looking at you towards the African Revolution, dying colonialism, and my 2 most favorite ones myself, The Wretched of the Earth, The Condemned of the Earth, and the famous, controversial, but absolutely brilliant Black Skin and White Masks. And my interview today, considering the depth and breadth of this man who died quite early, but left some substantial works, are going to be a few passages from Black Skin and White Masks and The Wretched of the Earth. So once again, here are the books towards the African Revolution, Dying Colonialism, Black Skin and White Masks, The Wretched of the Earth, and of course the works of my guest himself, whom many consider is the premier interpreter of the work of Frantz Fanon. What Fanon said in 2 editions by Lewis Gordon.
So, I brought 2 editions here. What Fanon said came out in April. This is the one with Fordham University Press, who's making quite a stir across the globe, this press. It's connected to the brilliant work of a woman by the name of Helen Tartar, who unfortunately passed away last year, but she brought an extraordinary community of writers to that press, and they have a unique, how can I put it? They have a unique commitment to putting together a press that is dedicated to ideas. Unfortunately, most university presses just do tenure books. And, you know, books that are really designed just simply for people's career paths. But Helen Tartar had a sense of people who are writing for the future, and I just want to, you know, just commemorate her. She was just a brilliant, brilliant editor, and the staff she assembled are really taking her legacy very well. They've really taken on the task. The red one is the South African edition by Wits University Press, and you see, if you're going to write a book that's really engaging with Fanon on his 90th birthday, you got to make it affordable for people in Africa. And so we worked it out that an African press will publish it at an affordable price for local Africans. And so in Southern Africa, that's the press. And in Europe, Hearst Publishers will be doing it. And the idea is for the book to be able to be accessible, that cost won't be prohibitive. Now, in terms of Fanon, yes, there are different things I've written on Fanon, but each project has a very different goal, so to speak. My very first book on Fanon, not my first book at all, my first book was Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism. But my book, Fanon and the Crisis of European Man, in that book I made the argument that if a thinker has really contributed to thought, then you should be able to engage that thought to build your intellectual projects. So that work used important ideas from Fanon for what Lewis Gordon was arguing about the human sciences. I had also edited a volume called Fanon, a Critical Reader with Renee White and T. Deneen Sharpley Whiting. And that, again, that was more a stage in which we were bringing together the question of Fanon studies. However, now we leap 20 years later. It's hard to believe that's 20 years ago.
It's amazing, yes.
But 20 years later, in between, one of the things I've done is in Existentia Africana, which is a book I wrote in 2000 for Routledge, I pointed out that there's a tendency to treat black thinkers as if there isn't thought, that somehow it's just experience. And the idea is whenever people thinking theory or thought, they go to the European thinkers. So there are a lot of people obsessed with whether Fanon was Hegelian, Sartrean, Marxian, you name it, Gramscian, you name it. However, you don't see this when a European thinker uses a black thinker's work, I mean, Max Weber used ideas from W.B. Du Bois. People don't ask, is Weber Du Boisian? Sartre used ideas from black thinkers. They're not asking, for instance, including Fanon's ideas, if he's Fanonian. And we can go through individuals ranging from Lévi-Strauss to Foucault. A lot of Fanon's ideas are used by Foucault. But that's a whole other matter. I wrote a book called An Introduction to Africana Philosophy. And one of the things I pointed out in that book is that it's one thing to say that you should engage the ideas. In other words, I was arguing against the de-intellectualizing of black thought. But it's one thing to say it, but it's another thing to do it. So I wrote a book covering more than a millennium of black thought, organized intellectually. And that organization of it intellectually meant that I had to raise as a philosophical problem the question of what it is to do black intellectual history. And in that book, that means then, you don't simply say this is what a thinker thought, this is what another thinker thought. No, one has to organize a very philosophy of history itself. And one of the things I argued is that if you look at the emergence of what's called black thought or African thought or Africana thought, which is African diasporic, or even Aboriginal black thought, anything that's designated black emerged in the Euro-modern world with a unique set of intellectual problems. And I argued there that those intellectual problems raise three fundamental questions. The first question is, what are we? And I call it a philosophical anthropological question. The second question which is something we all know about. We're talking about all the way even now to the elections in the United States, all the way through from Black Lives Matter, all of these things. It is freedom. But the third one, and this is where philosophy comes in. You see, even though those two are philosophical issues, you really get seriously philosophical with the third one, which is how do you justify what you say about the first two? And what I argued is that if you look at people who ask, what are we? What is freedom? And how do we justify even justification? Now we're in a higher level of philosophical terrain. Now, that was in a book I wrote called An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, and that was published by Cambridge University Press. However, that was looking at an entire constellation of ideas. The task now is how do you do it when you're dealing with an individual black thinker? Because you see the tendency, and Fanon, as we know, he basically rattled a lot of people. Because you see, if you say Fanon, for instance, there's a tendency when you look at this is a man who died at the age of 36, by the way. When you think of a black thinker, the impulse is to de-intellectualize him. People are more interested in his biography than in his life. Than in his thought. However, the complicated thing about Fanon is if you divorce his biography from his thought, if you try to deal with him as if you're from Lamputa, in the clouds. The problem, of course, is that Fanon's life was unusual precisely because his thought and his life met.
I see.
Many people tend to have a divergence of life and thought. So, for instance, we already know the expression, do as I say, not what I do. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people say a lot of things and they don't do it. Fanon, in a way, embarrassed a whole lot of intellectuals because what he said was what he meant and what he did. And one of the things about him is that he was an extraordinarily courageous individual from a child all the way through. So the task was how to tell the story. That's why it says it's a philosophical introduction to his life and thought. This book, in other words, although you see one book here, well, two versions of it, it's really two books in one. It's a book that's a philosophical treatment of philosophical biography.
Okay.
You see? In other words, many people, when you say biography, they just tell, person did X, person did Y, well, the person, who did. But a philosophical biography is something different. It's about what do we understand about ideas from this life. But the second part, of course, is to engage the actual thought that the thinker articulated. And that's why the book opened with saying, if you're going to say what someone said, there's always going to be the critic who would say, really? Is that what he really said?
Yes.
But of course, then you get to the next part where, you could talk about black letter words, but you could also talk about meaning. And then they say, but did the person really mean it? And of course, you see that meta theory, the theory about the theory. This is when you know you're in a different terrain. So the task now went from two to threefold. Philosophical biography, dealing with the ideas, and at the same time articulate a theory about how to deal with ideas themselves.
Incredible. And now this interview following the landscape that you've constructed for me is going to focus on the ideas.
Sure.
I intend to do
Before you do it, though, there's a biographical thing would like to say.
Of course.
To give the viewers a sense. You see, whenever you bring up Fanon, there are a lot of people who, in a knee-jerk reaction, would start talking about violence. And so it probably surprised you to find out in this book that Fanon was actually anti-violence. A lot of people don't know this. But of course, it requires understanding what violence is.
Correct.
What Fanon was against was the hypocritical pacifist. The person who could say, I'm against violence, so I won't do anything. Of course, there's a complicity. If you can go to bed at night while people are suffering or going through these levels of... People sleep very well in the United States when these police are pretty much rounding up black people and killing us all the time. Now, the fact of the matter is we know if this were happening to other groups of people, there would be a completely different reality. People talk about the civil rights movement as nonviolent. It was a very violent movement. It's just that it wasn't a lot of white people getting killed. It was black people getting killed. Same thing with South Africa, all across the globe. So what Fanon is basically says, if you're against violence, you do something about it. But you have to bear in mind is doing something about it is going to make you get constructed as violent. We forget that Martin Luther King, in his day, wasn't considered nonviolent. It's the way we retrospectively read him. In his day, the people saw Martin Luther King marching for dignity, saw him as violent. So that's the first thing, all right, to deal with that. The second thing is, a lot of people make a lot to do about Fanon being a psychiatrist, but they don't explain that he was two kinds of psychiatrists. He was a clinical psychiatrist, so he had patients, he did therapy, but a lot of people don't know he was a forensic psychiatrist as well. A forensic psychiatrist, you look at all these detective shows, they always have, the forensics person. He was that type of guy. Mm-hmm. He was a medically trained detective. And this is something people miss methodologically because they read him to try to find out, is he using Marxist dialectic, is he using phenomenology a certain way? But they fail to understand that he was also a trained investigator. However, and he brought that training to the very question of methods themselves. In other words, he was an investigator into how methods fail, and he was also a medical detective of colonialism and racism.
Correct.
And so the metaphor for Fanon, to try to imagine this, imagine there's a crime scene, and the crime scene is colonialism and racism, right? And you call in Dr. Fanon, mm-hmm. and he's like the Poirot, the detective. But he comes in, he's investigating, and he finds out who the criminals are. The criminals are the ones who hired him to investigate. How does he respond to that? In other words, the very system that trained him, the very system that produced that knowledge, the very system that's organizing the very world around him as the good guys are the culprits. And this is one of the reasons why Fanon was throughout a revolutionary, precisely because he moved from intrasystemic critique to extrasystemic critique. In other words, for him, the issue was also to hold the system accountable.
Correct. Thank you so much. I'm going to begin with Black Skin and White Masks.
By the way, that wasn't the original title of that book, It was his first proposed doctoral dissertation.
Yes.
But his committee were positivists, they wouldn't accept it. So he went and wrote another dissertation in 2 weeks. And but the original title was, I'll just use English for now.
Okay, go ahead.
Was on the disalienation of le nègre. Mm-hmm. Right? I say le nègre here because it's tricky. It means both Negro and, in quote, nigger. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And but it was Francis Janson, a protege of Sartre, who was the editor, and he recommended Peau noire, masque blanc, translated black skin, white mask. And in 1952, the classic was born.
That's right. Okay. So let me begin with this passage. It's from chapter 1. The Negro and Language. Fanon writes, the black man has two dimensions, one with his fellows, the other with the white man. A Negro behaves differently with a white man and with another Negro. That this self-division is a direct result of colonialist subjugation is beyond question. No one would dream of doubting that its major artery is fed from the heart of those various theories that have tried to prove that the Negro is a stage in the slow evolution of monkey into man. Perhaps we should
You'd like me to comment on that?
begin with this, yes.
Well,
very slowly and carefully.
The first thing is you may notice in the book I explain why I don't use Negro and black man. There are very specific places where Fanon means black man. And the difficulty is if you say le noir, many people would translate le noir as a black man, but actually the right translation should just be the black. And because, in other words, one wants to put it into contemporary parlance. Okay. And in contemporary parlance, what he's referring to are women and men. He's not referring to exclusively to males. Mm-hmm. And if we're talking about a structure imposed, there's a structure called the black, precisely because the people who are today black are descendants of people who had no reason before to consider themselves black, white, or anything like that. The people he's referring to used to be, for instance, Kikoyo, Luo, Asante, Telense, Zulu, Oza, many names like, those kind of categories. However, what Fanon is bringing out is that colonialism created these categories. Now, there's a paradox of created categories because all of us are born into a world of created categories. Mm-hmm. Some of us wish we could have chosen our parents, for instance, but life isn't that way. However, once that is there, unique questions are raised around what it is to be black versus to be white. Now, the crucial thing to bear in mind is that Fanon is there describing double consciousness, the doubled world, okay? The doubled world is the world in which, for instance, one is black, and one understands black as understood from the perspective as imposed by what is white. Mm-hmm. Okay? But, and here's the crucial thing, what racism and colonialism do is that they are projects designed to try to push a human being outside of human relations. The thing is that outside of human relations, you're just a thing, or if you're above human relations, you're a god. The human world, however, is a world in which people relate to each other, and that's why the black with blacks is in relations.
I see.
However, the effort to make the black in relation to white a non-relation, that's what racism is.
I see.
You see? Now, what Fanon then has as a critique, remember that first question? What are we? The philosophical anthropological question? Mm-hmm. Well, the short answer is a human being is a relationship.
I see.
And so all human beings are ultimately intersubjectively connected with each other. However, the more you close human beings outside of human relations, the more the human being becomes locked in her or his body. And the more that body is pushed out of relations, the more it becomes like a piece of meat, short, a thing. Now this is crucial because you see, relations go outward, and Fanon says explicitly to make the human being actional. So that means that your freedom, your humanity, is your ability to affect the human world, the social world. Okay? However, in a racist situation, this effort to lock you away from that means then it's dehumanizing you to the extent to which it puts you outside of relations. And you notice that's opening the chapter on language.
That's right.
Language is by definition public, communicative, relational. Mm-hmm. In fact, communication, communicology, communicative practice, all these terms come obviously from the Latin, together, okay? So the whole point is language makes no sense without communication. In fact, even when, as the famous, Jewish Austrian philosopher Wittgenstein pointed out, some people imagine that they could have a private language themselves, but they don't realize the moment they imagine the language, it's as if it's communicated to another. So it's not actually to the self as locked off self. So if you're completely locked off from communicability, you won't be able to have a language to begin with. So all language is about the social world. All racism is an effort to erode that world.
Okay. And now I'll move on to a controversial chapter on which you have commented quite brilliantly, I thought. So I want to do two things. One, I want to introduce my readers to the flavor, to the eloquence and beauty of Fanon's language. And then, just like you did, I would like you to comment.
Yeah, because all the, you may
reading.
notice all the translations are mine in
Yes,
the text.
of course.
I'm very dissatisfied with all the English translations.
Correct.
So.
This is from chapter 3, The Man of Color and the White Woman. Out of the blackest part of my soul, across the zebra striping of my mind, surges this desire to be suddenly white. I wish to be acknowledged not as black, but as white. Now, and this is a form of recognition that Hegel had not envisaged, who but a white woman can do this for me? By loving me, she proves that I'm worthy of white love. I'm loved like a white man. I am a white man. Her love takes me onto the noble road that leads to total realization. I marry white culture, white beauty, white whiteness. When my restless hands caress those white breasts, they grasp white civilization and dignity and make them mine.
Mm-hmm. That and the chapter that precedes it are two of the most misunderstood chapters of that text. To understand that, we should go back to the introduction.
Okay.
In the introduction, Fanon is very explicit. He said, some people will not be in this book. This is not a book about the people who are psychologically healthy. Yes. They miss that point.
Yes, it's in the introduction.
Fanon, and then Fanon adds the other important point. He says, but you should bear in mind that if you're in the world of the neurotic or even the psychotic, in their world, that's reality. Now, the thing that Fanon is addressing in the preceding chapter and that one is not interracial relationships. And this is the error of many people, because the title, it says the woman of color and the white man, the man of color and the white woman. They think it's about interracial relationships. It's not about that at all. The book, to understand this book, one has to understand that Fanon has actually created a special kind of text. There is the text, the character in the text, which is a naive individual who takes the racial order for granted, as it is. That's the first stage, double consciousness. But then there's the meta text. There's the potentiated double consciousness. That's the critic of the first double consciousness. That person says, listen, you idiot, you really think this society is for you. This society sees itself as normal if you're not in it. The metatextual, the internal one says, you're so negative. I belong here. I'm a Frenchman. That's what I am. Why are you bringing this nonsense in? I can be like anybody else in the society. In fact, that's what we say in this society, United States. I'm an American. My skin may be this way, but I'm an American like everybody else, blah, 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 blah. So the other one says, well, go ahead, but it's not only about the political society. It's not only about its attitudes and its sexual mores. It's also its science. A lot of its science cannot handle the realities of race and colonialism. The internal one says, what are you talking about? Science is not about race and colonialism. It's about objectivity. It's about rationality. The other one says, well, go ahead. So now Fanon is watching. Now, what Fanon is taking on in those two chapters is Lacanian psychoanalysis. And if for listeners who don't know what this is, to be honest with you, I think Freud was way, way better and astute in the human condition than Lacan, but that's a controversial matter. But let's go to Lacan. A lot of people like Lacan because he has what's called a semiological psychoanalysis, which is he looks at language, the signs and symbols, and he replaces classical psychoanalytical categories with language. Now, a classical psychoanalytical way of looking at this is to look at it, for instance, through how one understands patriarchy and gender and feminism. The short way of it is, what makes a man a man? Well, a man becomes a man because he has the authority over language. What makes a woman a woman? The need for the man to use his authority over language on her. You got it? As a consequence, Mad Capacia, which is in the previous chapter, because for her, black men aren't men. Only white men can be men. As a consequence, she needed a white man to give her the words that would make her a woman.
Yes.
The words are, I love you. The problem, Fanon pointed out, is she doesn't want the words, I love you. She wants the words, I love you as I would a white woman.
I see.
Because that's, for Fanon, is the black who doesn't want to be white. Doesn't want to be black.
Black. Mm-hmm.
Now, so there are black people who have no problem with being black. There are black people who are not interested in being white. That's a healthy person.
Yes.
But there are black people who think the world is, if you're not white, you're not anything. So the only thing you can be is white. And that's her. Now, in that, if you stay at Mad Capacia, you still have the structure of a male, a white male, who gives authority and value to a female. It's just that she's black. The thing is, this black female, a black male can't give it. It has to be a white male. You got it? Now, here's the part that's interesting. At that point, it's familiar terrain. And in fact, we already know, because that's how a lot of colonialism and racism functioned. For instance, a study at NYU on the Y chromosomal structure of men in the New World revealed that 98% of the Y chromosomal line in the New World was from European males. That tells you a lot of men of color didn't get to reproduce. And in other words, most men of color go back to a white male as a father.
I see.
So this is just a brute fact, colonialism. So we know a small set of white men had access to a lot of women of color and whites. But now Fanon says, if Lacan is right, and this is why he opens it that way, a black male, if he wants to be a man, should be able to meet a white female or a black female, but in this case a white female, with the ability to give her value through her recognizing his manhood.
Okay.
That's the premise. Now, he opens that way because Fanon's goal is to show the man he described in that opening is a sick man. Now, how do we know? Here's the problem. Later in the chapter, he tells the story of a man who is an évolué. That's a French expression for a person who's maybe black skin, but he's just, white. In the United States, they call him Oreo. In South Africa, they call him coconuts, brown on the outside, white on the inside. He meets a white woman who says she loves him. He supposedly loves her. But at first, he disparages her, telling her she's shaming herself by expressing love to a black man. So already he's brought up into the racial economy. But here's the part that's interesting. If a man is going to end a relationship with a woman, he usually meets her and say, we can't be together. If he's going to write a letter ending the relationship, he should at least send the letter to her. But as you know, in that chapter, the study he makes is of a black man who sends a letter to a white man explaining that he's not going to marry the white woman who's in love with him. The white man sends back a letter to the black man telling him that he's not really a black man and is therefore deserving to be with this white woman. And what Fanon's point is this. Fanon's point is that that black man, and he was telling it through Jean Venus, who's, René Marin. It's based on an autobiographical novel. That black man is looking for the exact same thing the black woman in the previous chapter was looking for, namely the affirmation of his right to exist through words from a white man. In other words, it opens up that way, but that white woman cannot give that black man those words. It's a white man, which means structurally that black, and actually it was a mulatta, it was a mixed black woman, and this black man are both seeking the same thing. But Lacanian psychoanalysis says that shouldn't be, because he should be a male. You see what I'm getting at?
That's right.
Showing up saying, look, I got the words to this female. Fanon's answer is, how do you explain that? And the answer is, because it's mediated by colonialism and racism.
Precisely.
That is the point. And in that world, that black male is not a man. Now, man is a more complicated question in psychoanalysis and in philosophy, okay? Because it's connected to all kinds of issues. For instance, authority. It's connected to the fact that you see it, all of this stuff we're seeing happening in the streets of the United States and across the world. For instance, any white male police officer thinks he is the man, which by definition already has structure within it, the humiliation of black women and men. And people are missing this, This brutality, the large number we see are black men, but this brutality is waged exactly that way on black women, precisely because of this structure, including and it's in the actual office, because black male police officers behave the same way. In psychoanalytical terms, the role of the police officer is shifted from the protector now to the man as authority that is actually protecting himself and is looking for sacrifices.
Okay.
So and so that's what that chapter is about. That chapter, remember that point about the meta text?
That's right.
The naive person in the text now says he's trying to be supposedly a man, but he looks for approval to be a man. And in fact, the letter the white guy sends him says, "You black, no, you're just extremely brown." And so the metatextual part says that science failed. Now, here's a tricky thing. It doesn't mean that psychoanalysis fails. It's that kind of psychoanalysis.
That fails.
Because you see, there's more that's going on with psychoanalysis than people would think of. I didn't have time to elaborate it here, but it's very funny. I think if a lot of viewers were to sit down and read Freud's Moses and Monotheism, they'll be in for a very, very rude awakening. If you took the name Freud out and just read the book as it is, you would swear it was written by an Afrocentrist.
I see.
Because Freud is unequivocal, for instance, that the origins of Moses and monotheism is African. And he doesn't mean African simply as just geographical. He means black. He also is very, very unequivocal that we have to understand the complexity, that it totally makes sense if the groundwork of all humanity is going to come out of Africa, then the mythological foundations of fatherhood, motherhood are going to come out of there. But we're in a very strange situation because there is a form of historical social guilt about that relationship to the father, which creates investment in the son. And that, Freud argues, is Christianity. But implicit in it, then, is that there is a form of guilt because ultimately all humanity today knows every time we walk around and we look at that blackness, we know what we're looking at. And you see it in the Star Wars film, that moment when Darth Vader says, "I am your father." Well, in a similar way, all blackness, all Africanness around is the constant reminder that there is a form of patricide that we're dealing with as humanity right now in the system of values we have. Now, that kind of psychoanalysis is something that Fanon actually would have been exploring more, but he died very young. But I argue there, he's arguing against the notion. What he does prove there is that the notion that psychoanalysis is ontological, which is a technical philosophical term for absolute being or absolute reality, is false. But that doesn't follow that if it's not ontological, that it doesn't follow that it's not meaningful.
Okay.
And so Fanon, who was actually really astutely committed to looking through psychoanalysis, was curious to look at the meaning. And in fact, to give the critique of psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, he ironically used psychoanalysis.
Okay, and now we have about 20 minutes left, unless there are certain important matters that I might have overlooked in Black Skin and White Masks to which you would like to point to. I think I should move to the Wretched of the Earth. I would like to spend about 20 minutes or so.
Sure, there are many things. I devote 2 chapters to discussing Punwamas Blanc, Black Skin White Mask. Only 2 things I'd like to say. The first thing is, it's very important to understand and pay attention to Fanon's theory of failure. People today talk about failure a lot, and they don't understand the concept, you see? You know, a lot of times when people tell you not to do something, they often say, and you ask why, they say because it didn't work. And you say, why didn't it work? And the answer is often, well, I tried it. Now, who says if I tried it, it didn't work, when you tried it won't? In fact, even further, who says that my failure hasn't set the conditions for your success? So one of the things about failure, and this is brilliant in Fanon, Fanon understood that if you're going to deal with something as complex as racism and colonialism, sexism, homophobia, all those categories, and you're trying to deal with social change, it means you should understand failure not as that which you abandon, but failure is that which you understand.
Ah, I see.
That's the first thing. The second thing is, there's an ironic relationship Fanon has with Simone de Beauvoir. And she wrote The Second Sex, and a lot of Punwamas Blanc is structured similar to it. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the person who encouraged her to write The Second Sex was Richard Wright.
I see.
So you have this intimate relationship between black or Africana thought and feminist thought.
Okay.
And I've argued against their disaggregation. You see, I've argued that they've been symbiotic from day one.
Okay. And now we move to the Wretched of the Earth.
Which, as you know, I don't like the title. It's Le Damné de la Terre, and I have a long discussion of damned and condemnation and why that is very important. So throughout the book, when I refer to it in English, I refer to it as the damned of the earth, or just damné.
So what I'll do is I'm going to reread a classic statement, which you will quite correctly argue, I think, is one of the most highly distorted Fanonian insights into the nature of violence. I begin with the beautifully articulated paragraph that introduces violence. National liberation, national renaissance, the restoration of nationhood to the people, Commonwealth. Whatever may be the headings used or the new formulas introduced, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. At whatever level we study it, relationships between individuals, new names for sports clubs, the human admixture at cocktail parties, in the police, on the directing boards of national or private banks. Decolonization is quite simply the replacing of a certain species of man by another species of man.
Yeah, it's a great opening, isn't it?
Remarkable.
It's also absolutely correct. And this is where a lot of people don't understand Fanon. So I'll just elaborate.
Please.
There's no such thing as a settler society or any colonial order that doesn't see itself as just. In a nutshell, correct?
Correct.
If you see yourself as just, for instance, if you're a settler, the land you own, you're going to show the deed, the property rights, and say, I bought this. I own it. It's mine. I've done nothing wrong. Nobody in the United States, every Native American in the United States is looking at somebody who is a settler on Native American land. Nobody in the United States who's a non-Native American says, I am sitting on stolen land. You see? So, from this point of view of the settlers and them, it's all just. Now, by definition, if you take something away from somebody that he or she has justly acquired, you have committed an act that is unjust. In fact, you have committed a violent act. You have violated the rights of a person who has something just. So that's the basic thing. Now you look at, say, the Native American here, the colonized, the settler, the people on whose stuff is taken from them. Their position is my land, my society, my way of life has been unjustly taken from me. To do nothing about it is to maintain injustice. You see? So if I were to be restorative, or if I were to try to fix things, that would require taking away from those people who say they have justly acquired what they have. You see the problem? In other words, status quo, violence. Change the status quo, violence. That's why Fanon says decolonization is always violent, because the only thing that will satisfy the people in possession, the settlers, the haves, is if you don't change the system. By definition for them, to change it would be violent. So to meet their criterion of nonviolence is to do what? Nothing.
I see.
Now, the second part, the error, however, and this is what Fanon is concerned about, suppose you take it from them. The problem is you're taking it from them, you're switching the possessions, but you're keeping the grammar of the system.
Yes.
Well, that is a system premised on violence. And so replacing one species with another, well, now you have some people who are happy to be what? Now to be the dominating group. But it's still violence. So Fanon addresses this issue in the wonderful chapter on the post-colonial bourgeoisie. I'll be quick. He says they're good for nothing. These are ideas he got he elaborated from E. Franklin Frazier. E. Franklin Frazier wrote a wonderful book called Black Bourgeoisie. It was originally published in French in 1956, the same year as the Black Writers' Congress in Paris. So they all knew this book. What E. Franklin Frazier argued against was you see, in the United States, after the Civil War, a lot of black people did actually ascend, got into politics, were acquiring material wealth. But this country systematically created a system of laws and terror to steal away that wealth and resources from black people, to create black people in a situation of being subordinated into the role of acquiring wealth only through mediating race relations, as they call it. Okay. But so E. Franklin Frazier pointed out, that's not real wealth. That's actually being at the mercy and the conditions of whites. Well, you now put it in the colonial situation. The decolonization movement now has a group of individuals whose legitimacy was in the moment of decolonization. And the problem is their strength is out to deal with the colonization moment. So right afterwards, they become the mediators between the former colonizers and the current group without building up the infrastructure of the society. And so what happens, what Fanon argues, is a new condition of violence, because to maintain their legitimacy, you cannot go beyond the decolonizing moment They become the national heroes and so forth without building up the infrastructure. But what Fanon wants is for them now to understand that their talent is not for the building of the nation. It was for the decolonial moment, their violence.
Okay.
But the new nation requires the next generation to use their resources that are indigenous to that historic moment to build up a better society.
Well, since you are quite rightly celebrated at this moment, in my judgment, as the premier interpreter of Frantz Fanon, among many, many other things that you've done, and since we're celebrating this great man's 90th birthday, we have about 3 minutes left. I would like you to choose a theme that you think is supra-worthy of Fanon, that my viewers, thousands of them, should know by way of celebrating his 90th birthday. What would that insight, that argument, that philosophical idea be?
Fanon was ironic because he really wanted to be wrong. If he saw the world today, he'd be very upset. But the thing about Fanon that we should bear in mind is that Fanon was a profound believer in human agency. For Fanon, the human being had to take responsibility for responsibility itself. So for Fanon, in all of his writings, the big issue is how does one develop a mature consciousness? And maturity for Fanon, in other words, humanity needs to grow up. And the error we make is to think growing up means being boring. What growing up is realizing the responsibility we have for the world we're going to build, and that we don't have perfect foresight, but whatever world that's to come is going to be built on our labor, our work, our convictions, our commitments. Fanon had no room for people who would not take the responsibility of commitment.
Okay. Well, we have 2 minutes left, I think. I still would like to give you this 2 minutes to again choose a second theme, a second insight that you would like my viewers to remember Fanon on his 90th birthday. The first one that you just summarized was extraordinary, maturity of consciousness. One more minute.
Well, the other thing is that Fanon really believed in life and love. He said that humanity is not simply a no, humanity is also a yes. And I would like people to remember that in spite of all the revolutionary work and all the fighting, all the struggles, all the times he dealt with torture, all of the times he dealt with the vicissitudes of life, Fanon also knew how to enjoy life. He didn't trust human beings who didn't know how to live. And Fanon, all of the people who knew him loved him because they understood that he knew how to reach out to his fellow human being as a human being.
This has been your host, Theodoros Kiros, for African Ascent.